Chains, Chapter 29. I was the only person on the street. The army was gone and the city abandoned. I shivered, though the day was still warm. Had I made a mistake? Should I run after the rebels and join them? Should I go back to Lockton's? A cannon boomed to the north. No, I chose the right course. At least, I hope I had. I headed for the waterfront. Several of the grand mansions of the lower Broadway stood with their doors ajar. A fire burned at the edge of the street, heaped with books and scads of papers. The smoke rose up in the air, drifting towards the masts of a few ships at anchor. Cannons boomed again. What if they didn't arrive right away? How long did I have before Madame grew suspicious? A gust of wind blew and carried with it the first hint of fall. Canoe-shaped chestnut leaves turned yellow round the edges. The leaves caught and piled up against the soldiers' tents left behind at the battery compound. I walked over and pulled back a flap of a tent. Inside lay 2 bedrolls, a pipe of tobacco pouch, and a shirt dropped in the middle of mending, the needles still threaded and stuck into the fabric. I closed the flap. They left near everything: tents, blankets, extra clothing, cook pots, and food. It would be a cold night for Curzon and his companions. Voices came from the waterfront, military voices shouting orders. I hurried away from the barracks, dashed down Water Street, and hid behind the rain barrel at the corner of the joiner's workshop. A half-dozen flat-bottomed boats were being rowed to the docks. 2 were already tied up, and tall soldiers were wearing the red uniform of King George were striding down the street. Lobsterbacks, folks called them. They fanned out across the water, their muskets primed and held at a ready position. As I watched, a third boat floated to the wharf. The soldiers on it jumped out and marched in formation to the battery in search of rebel soldiers. A woman carrying a baby fled, screaming loudly. A few of the redcoats chuckled and stabbed in the air with their bayonets, and my throat went dry. As the fourth boat landed, an officer stepped off and barked a command at the laughing men. They lined up and stood at attention. The officer gave another command, and the men marched off, splitting into 3 groups to investigate the battery and the waterfront buildings. The officer stood alone at the foot of the dock, surveying the deserted town as more boats splashed towards the landing spot. This was my chance. I forced myself out of my hiding place and walked towards him, my back ramrod straight. "Begging your pardon, sir," I said boldly. "What is it, girl?" he asked. Before I could answer, a soldier dashed up to him. "Captain Campbell, sir. The campground appears to be deserted. The rebels left behind their tents and their bedrolls." "Secure the tent flaps. Open and check every one," the captain commanded. "It could be a trap." "Yes, sir," came the crisp reply before the man ran off. I prayed that I would not faint from fear and tried again for the captain's attention. "I can cook, sir," I said, "and I can wash, and sew, and even doctor the sick a little." "Don't bother me, child." I trailed off after him as he walked up towards the campground. "Please, sir," I insisted. "I'm all kinds of useful. I can chop wood and carry water or messages." I was interrupted by another soldier who approached us and saluted. "Report," Captain Campbell said. "The spies were correct, sir. The rebels have retreated. The battery is empty of men, but filled with the provisions and weapons they left behind, including several cannons. They even left a tea kettle bubbling over the fire. Civilians in the first 3 streets north of here all attest to their haste. Putman's unit was the last one out. They're on their way up the island, by the way of Greenwich Road. Do we pursue, sir?" The captain fought a smile that played at the corner of his lips. "Our task is to occupy the city. We'll let the Highlanders hunt them down. Tell the men to take over the barrels and prepare Washington's headquarters for General Robertson." "Yes, sir." The soldier saluted again, but did not move. "What is it now, Jennings?" asked the captain. "Begging your pardon, sir, but I have not been informed as to the whereabouts of Washington's headquarters. If I was to be given that information, I could pursue my obligations with greater speed." "I don't know where it is," Captain Campbell said, with irritation. "Use your noggin, man. Ask the tavern keeper." "You want the Kennedy Mansion, sir?" I asked, "just beyond the end of the battery, facing Bowling Green." "What did you say?" The captain fired at me. My knees were shaking under my skirt. The Kennedy Mansion, sir. That was General Washington's main headquarters. Number 1, Broadway. His wife stayed up at the Mortair House, but he kept his headquarters straight that way. I pointed west, and more army offices were in City Hall. I pointed north, up Broad Street. Very good, he said. There you have it, Sergeant. Proceed. The sergeant yelled to his unit as he walked away from us. The waterfront was awash in red now as a boatload of soldiers disembarked. Shouted orders filled the air, along with nervous laughter and the sound of British boots on cobblestones. A few more boats were on their way, with the first boats headed back for more. The occupation was well and truly begun. You are correct, young miss, Captain Campbell said to me. You are useful. But we do not want troublemakers in our camp. What is that meaning of the mark on your face? I touched the raised scar, and decided honesty was my only course. It stands for insolence, sir. When my mistress sold my little sister, I tried to run away. She's only 5 years old, sir, and my sister, not my mistress. He blinked and cleared his throat. Regrettable. And understandable. I have a younger sister myself. Your mistress, I am to assume that she supports the rebel cause? No, sir, I answered. Our house is a Tory. My master was driven out of town by the Patriot leaders. My mistress, much cheered by your arrival. She wants to hire a proper staff so she can entertain again. She'll not miss my services one bit. The words stumbled out before I measured them. The captain's mouth hardened, and I knew I had stepped wrong. He tugged on his sash. I cannot accept your service, child. We only employ slaves run away from rebel owners. Did I not hear him right? Pardon me? Gentlemen docking, sir, cried a soldier on the wharf. Captain Campbell turned as the men tossed thick ropes from the dock to the occupants of the next boat. I contained only 4 soldiers, each manning an oar. The rest of the passengers were men dressed in expensive civilian clothes. When they are ashore, escort them into the tavern for a celebration, the captain said loudly. Issue the tavern keeper an office of forage certificate. Warn him, sergeant, he is not to ask the gentleman for payment unless he wants to spend his night in the irons. They are our guests. Yes, sir, came the enthusiastic response. As we began talking, ordinary city folk began to creep out of their houses. Now, there was a full crowd gathered in the Tories of New York who had been awaiting for this day for months and for years. Cheers were heard in the distance, and arriving soldiers were greeted by townsmen who shook their hands and patted them heartily on the back. I recognized a few faces, the Reverend and his wife, and a few people who had called at the Lockton home. Captain Campbell bent towards me. He spoke quickly and quietly. I do not hold with slavery, but I cannot help you. We do not interfere with loyalist property. Return to your mistress. A loud "Huzzah!" from 100 throats came from under the battery as the American flag was pulled down. A drummer started beating time, and the Union Jack rose to the top of the flagpole, accompanied by whistles and shouts from the lobsterbacks, the loyalist New Yorkers who took off their hats in respect. A woman in the crowd snatched the American flag out of the hands of a British soldier and stomped it under her boots, and the men laughed. The rat-a-tat-tatting of the drumsticks rattled through me, setting my teeth to shaking and walking the bees who had lately gone to sleep in my brain pan. He couldn't take me. He would not. I was chained between 2 nations. The bees swarmed again behind my eyes, making the scene grow dim and distant. The sun was nearing the horizon, casting long shadows across the wharf. I was a ghost tied to the ground, not a living soul. All ashore, sir, called the soldiers, tying up the last boat. All ashore, corporal, the captain acknowledged. I want patrols assembled immediately to keep watch in the streets, and sentry fires built on every corner. Yes, sir. The gentleman who had arrived in the boat walked towards us, walking with great excitement. One of them was painfully familiar. He called to me before I could flee. Sal, called Master Elihu Lockton, thinner from his exile, eyes bloodshot and weary. Is that you? I dropped into a curtsy and dared not say a word. He studied me with suspicion. "What are you doing here?" Sergeant Jennings approached. "The tavern is open, if the gentleman would care to drink to victory." Lockton waved to his companions. "I shall join you shortly." As the gentleman hurried to the tavern, his eyes traveled to my head, down to my shoes and back. "What's news, Sal?" he asked. "How do you come to be here?" I pulled Madame's list from my pocket and prayed that it would not look blank, that he would not look inside my basket. "Come to market, sir," I whispered. "Ah, what is this?" He took my chin in his fingers, turning it so the last rays of sunset fell on my scar. "Is the I for illustrious, or perhaps impertinent?" My face both burned in the scar and where the lavender-smelling fingers pinched my skin. The bees flew through me and told me to grab Campbell's sword and run it through Lockton's belly. And then what? And then what? "I suspect it stands for insolence," Captain Campbell said calmly. "'Tis a common brand among the people of Boston." Lockton laughed at the small joke and released me. "Now, we'll call her Insolent Sal, a very saucy gal." The captain smiled and put his hand on the hilt of his sword. "I should have known she was attached to your household, sir. She greeted me in the name of the king, and thanked me for rescuing the city from the rebels." They both looked at me. "We pray for liberation, I say." "Even our slaves have become political," Lockton said. "How quaint." "Don't you wish to accompany your servant home to greet your mistress?" the captain asked. Lockton shook his head. "Not at the moment. Go home, Sal. Tell Anne I shall be along after I lifted a few glasses in celebration." The two men headed for the tavern as the sun finally dropped out of sight. I must have gone to Mason's and bought the items on Madame's list, though I remember it not. My body moved through the streets, past the sentry fires, and redcoats carrying torches down suspicious alleys and into abandoned houses. Around me was the sound of victors celebrating and the smell of meat they roasted for their supper. All around me, all was darkness.